I think there is nothing about having a dual citizenship that should disqualify anyone from being a politician. But I do think that you have to be honest with Canadians.
It's always the same with this guy. He's always really quick at giving lessons and lectures and sermons about how everyone else should live their lives. And when it comes to his own personal behavior, he's a complete hypocrite.
Welcome back to Power and Politics. We're here with the Power panel, Corey Tonight, Kathleen Monk, Rob Silver, and Eric Grenier. I want to start off with kind of circle back to what we were talking about last week in attempting to define what this election is about. Eric, you wrote a really interesting piece over this weekend that I really enjoyed that looked kind of historically back at elections that have been as close as this one appears to be, right, based on polling. What did you find?
Well, the three elections I could find where you had this race that was just as close and for just as long. You had to go back to the 1979 election. That was the one that Pierre Trudeau lost to Joe Clark. What the end result of that election was that the Liberals won the popular vote, but the Conservatives won the most seats. You could have the reverse of that scenario play out this time because of the vote efficiency for the two parties. You go to an election like 2004, where just right up until Election Day, the polls were showing a neck-and-neck race, and some of the pollsters were suggesting that the Conservatives were going to win. Of course, Paul Martin ended up beating Stephen Harper by about 7 points nationwide, so that was a bit of a polling miss in that case. And then there's 2015. We forget that still into the beginning of October, it was looking like a very close race. The New Democrats were still very much in the game at that stage of the race. And it was only in the last few weeks that things really shifted. So it's a couple lessons of what could happen here, where that we get a bit of a surprise on election night, or between now and Election Day, things are completely transformed, and with the debates coming up, there's a lot of potential for that to happen.
I know not everything is all about the polls, Kathleen, but does the static nature of things so far, do you think, inform the strategy going forward for the parties? And in what way?
Well, it does put a bit more pressure for something to come out of the debates, for there's some kind of turning point. I think, or I would put it this way, something to happen before Turkey weekend, Thanksgiving weekend, right? Traditionally, when you look at when waves happen in elections, they normally take 13 to 10 days to kind of really crest and fill out. So that really puts us around Thursday, Friday of this week to have a real breakout if there is going to be some kind of wave. I'm not sure if that's going to happen in this election. It might be like this right up until the very end, but it does put pressure on what happens not only Monday, but also on Thursday in terms of those debates. But that, you know, we always talk, pundits particularly like to talk about these knockout punches, and I just don't. They're hard to get.
Yeah, Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, they're really hard to get with 6 people on stage.
And we'll talk about that in a moment, too.
To say something that may be trite to everybody watching this, there isn't one national debate election going on. There's 338 local elections going on. And so while the national numbers, just the way the numbers have worked out, have been very static, and Eric obviously does a really good job at breaking it down province by province, but he can only do what is available publicly. There has been some movement when you start digging into it. The rise of the Bloc in Quebec in particular is complicated in terms of how it plays out in ridings. And you don't necessarily, because the Bloc only runs candidates in Quebec, you don't even notice it necessarily if you're just looking at the national horse race numbers. But it has potential to be very complicated in terms of splits in ridings. And when you start looking at BC, for example, where you have in some cases 4-way splits, trying to predict based on a national or even a province-wide poll how that riding is going to break down is a fool's game. And I'm not calling Eric a fool, obviously. I'll do that off.
Never.
I'm not a pollster, so I would never make those kinds of accusations against Eric.
We save that for them, yeah.
We'll keep that off air. But the campaigns, I think, especially the Conservatives and the Liberals, I don't know if, as I've said last week, I don't know if they're doing nightly tracking polls of where they're targeted. But Andrew Scheer's campaign will know exactly as of today how many ridings he feels he has in the bank and where the next 10 ridings are. And the campaigns have a pretty good sense of that, and therefore they know what issues are resonating in those ridings and what they need to do to try to bring those ridings into the bank. Whether it works or not is a whole other question.
Corey, is that a fair assessment, do you think, of what's happening behind the scenes right now?
Look, I would totally agree with Rob in terms of polling and tracking polling in political parties. The NDP, I think, typically have a little less money to spend on this kind of stuff, but for the Conservatives and Liberals, they know better than anyone where it is, because the scale and the depth and the granularity of the polling that they're doing is infinitely better than the public polls that are available to folks. So they'll know exactly where things are at, and they'll be, making campaign decisions on the basis of that. So, it's great to armchair quarterback from where I'm sitting on this, but they will have a much better picture of what's going on. I think it is fair to say, though, the Liberals have a far more efficient vote in this election. But I would say that the Conservatives have an enthusiasm advantage. I think part of the story of the Trudeau victory in 2015 was the marijuana vote, of getting millennials hyped up and coming out in much bigger numbers than they typically do to vote on that issue. I would describe them as low information voters and not typical voters. And I don't think they put anything in the window that's going to attract them that way. I think they put a bunch of things in the window that are disappointments. I think they've reneged on some key promises. I think the climate change debate and rallies actually have probably not done any favors for Trudeau with millennial voters. I think he's been a disappointment on a bunch of fronts. But I think for opposition politicians, not just in this case, but almost every case, the enthusiasm is more with the opposition than they are with the government, especially going to your second term. So while the Liberals have a more efficient vote, I think it's counterbalanced by an enthusiasm gap that favors the Conservatives. So we'll see how that all plays out, but I think it's a pretty even fight.
I just have a few minutes left, Eric, but I did want to get into a lot of the stuff that we heard this week. Prior, we were talking about climate. There's a lot of stuff on affordability messaged out. But then over the past week, we've seen a ton of various sort of, you're the bigger hypocrite, no, you're the bigger hypocrite. Lots of, not to take away from the validity of those issues, but do you see any sort of punching through of that stuff? And if so, who does it affect?
Well, I think that's the point of it, is just to undermine each leader in the eyes of voters. And if you can kind of work it out into a draw where you can't trust either of them, then you're just back where you started at the beginning. And I think that's really what's happening here. We haven't really seen any significant movement, no trends building. And while there has been some movement, as Rob says, in some of the provincial levels, not yet enough to really shake this election up. And just to go back, party pollsters, often know quite a bit, and they have lots more data than we get to work with. But I do believe that Mitt Romney believed he was going to become president in 2012. So not every party is right.
Campaigns lie to candidates
They do,
sometimes.
yeah.
You need to keep showing up. Sometimes
That was a
you need
religious
to lie.
belief, not a polling-based belief.